Good morning. I am Nicholas Denisenko, and I am the Emil and Elfrida Joachim University Professor and Chair at Valparaiso University in Indiana in the United States. Welcome to a special webinar titled Putin's War on Ukraine, History, Politics, and What's at Stake. On February 24th, 2022, President Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation opened a, quote, special military operation aimed at the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Thus far, thousands of soldiers and hundreds of civilians have died from missile and rocket attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure. In the months leading up to the invasion, Putin presented a rationale for these acts of war in bits and pieces. He has claimed in no particular order that Ukraine and Russia are one people, and that Lenin created Ukraine in the formative years of the Soviet Union, that the Ukrainian government has committed genocide in Donbass and is secretly developing nuclear weapons, that Ukraine discriminates against Russian speakers and was in the process of a crackdown on the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, also known as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. Clearly, many more parties are involved. Putin's grievances include the expansion of NATO and a series of accusations that Ukraine's current policies and desire for membership in the European Union and NATO have been orchestrated by the United States. The truth is that Putin did not invent all of these ideas. Ukraine and its historical path to sovereignty remain a mystery to many in the world who view Ukraine as merely a part of Russia. The notion that the United States is the architect of anti-Russian policy has roots in the Cold War and during the period of the breakup of the Soviet Union. How can we make sense of Ukraine's history, the manipulation of history, Putin's objectives, Ukraine's policies, and why this war matters to the world outside of Ukraine and Russia? It is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists who will speak on these issues today. Dr. Natalia Kovalchuk is from the Department of Modern and Contemporary History at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, with expertise on the history of empires and nations in Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Oksana Shevel is Associate Professor at Tufts University in Massachusetts in the United States, with expertise in nation and state building, democratization, and the Donbass region. Our process works accordingly. Dr. Kovalchuk will speak first, followed immediately by Dr. Shevel, and then we will have plenty of time for a moderated question and answer session. Please put your questions in the Q&A bar at the bottom of the screen, and we will take as many of them as we can. At this point, I will turn the podium over to Dr. Kovalchuk. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. So it is clear, I think, that the Russian president lives in a distorted reality. Also, there is no denying that his version of Ukrainian and Russian history stands behind his misapprehension of the present. In other words, Putin consistently uses historical arguments to justify his political and military moves. 15 minutes is certainly not enough time to analyze Putin's version of history, so I'm going to single out several talking points he made within the last years. Some of them concern medieval times, some were made about very recent history. I will not cover them chronologically, but rather in order of importance as I see it. So in 2005, addressing the upper chamber of the Russian parliament, Putin famously called the disintegration of the Soviet Union, I quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. According to Putin, It left tens of millions of our fellow citizens, continue quoting, outside of the borders of the Russian territory. Apparently, he imagines that the Soviet Union was an exclusively Russian state. If the founders of the Soviet Union heard this statement, they would be surprised, to say the least. The whole point of the Union Treaty of 1922 was to create a federation of independent nations, free and equal, and to end Russian oppression of other nationalities within the Russian Empire. Also, few would deny that the real and greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was not the disintegration of the Soviet Union, but rather the Second World War, which claimed the lives of about 60 million people. It was very clear by now that Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. No accident that he made his first revanchist geopolitical statement less than a year after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. The revolution took place in 2004. This revolution was a profound shock to Putin when his proxy was not able to win the election or force the election, because he considered Ukraine on some deep ethnic level is Russian, and as such, it ought to be part of Russian political space. In many ways, Putin's vision of history includes elements of the Stalinist version of Ukrainian and Russian past. For example, he claims that Kievan Rus was the foundation of the future Russian state. It was a quote. The Russian historical narrative also presented Kievan Rus as the birthplace of Ukrainians and Russians. The story went on that history forced them apart, they suffered, and eventually they came together and lived happily ever after, until they didn't. That is why Putin follows Soviet historiography in praising the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654. For Ukrainians, it was a regular military treaty, but the Soviet narrative interpreted it as the older brother and younger sister finally coming together and restoring normal course of events. Putin is consistently denying Ukraine's unique and separate identity. In 2013, at the meeting of the Valdai Club, the club is a place where Russian political and intellectual elites come together. So Putin said, I quote, "Russia and Ukraine are essentially one people. We have a common tradition, common mentality, common history, and common culture. Our languages are very close." So for him, the identity of the Ukrainian nation is a part of the great Russian world. Among Ukrainian territories, Putin is especially interested in the so-called Southeast, which never existed as a unitary region in historical, economic, or demographic terms. Over time, Putin developed the story about so-called Novorossiya, New Russia, which included Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. He claimed that these were not part of Ukraine during the imperial time and were transferred to Ukraine in the 1920s instead by the Soviet government. He also explains that this new Russia was created by the victories of Catherine II. This whole story is a fantasy. In fact, Kharkiv, the center of the Ukrainian Cossack regiment in the 17th century, never belonged to this province of New Russia, which was very short-lived. Since it was the first capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, founded in 1990, it could not have been transferred to Ukraine in the 20s. And finally, the core of the original province of New Russia was the Cossack Republic of Zaporizhia, was destroyed by Russian troops in 1775. Generally, Putin's vision of the imperial Russian nation cannot accommodate the present Ukrainian state in its borders. That's why he repeatedly dismantles Ukraine bit by bit in his narratives. Besides the southeast, Putin also singles out the evil western Ukraine, the home of radical nationalists and neo-Nazis. In his view, in the past, these territories belonged to Czechoslovakia, partly to Austria, Austria-Hungary, Poland, and nowhere Ukrainians were full-fledged citizens of those countries. Putin is ignorant, otherwise he would know that Ukrainian peasants in the Austria-Hungary would vote and be elected to the parliament already in 1848. While in the Russian Empire, no form of political representation existed prior to 1905. And he also forgets or is ignorant of the fact that Austria guaranteed the cultural rights of Ukrainians and other nationalities, while in the Russian Empire they were brutally suppressed. So to sum up, Putin's historical fantasy include all the basic components of nationalist thinking and longing for empire, the lost empire. And we have a problem with such fantasies because they form Putin's assessments of the present and also his actions. That's why it's so important to critically assess such claims and to deconstruct them. According to Putin, Ukraine never had an agency of its own. Both Ukrainian revolutions of 2004, 2014 were inspired and staged by the West. And his aim and his role in history, as he sees it, is to bring Ukraine to where it belongs, to the big, great Russian world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kovalchuk. We will want to remind all of our guests to post your questions in the Q&A section. And at this point, we will turn to Dr. Oksana Shevel from Tufts University, who will give us a perspective from political science. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Professor, and I appreciate that Dr. Kovalchuk gave great historical analysis, so I'll sort of pick up at 1991 and talk about more contemporary issues. Of course, there is great irony in this whole situation that we now have, and I want to talk a little bit about it. So this whole narrative of Putin wanting to, keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence and prevent Ukraine's membership in NATO and, supposedly guarantee Russia's security this way and all of these things were there already and would have stayed there had he not done what he done. Let me explain a little bit. So Ukraine, exactly because of the complex history that it had, that it didn't have a long history of independent statehood, that it has been controlled, the territory of today's Ukraine has been controlled by different political entities before. So when Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine was what often was described as being divided between East and West. If we had more time, we could sort of discuss the nuances of this divide because it was never sort of as simple as some, stable geographic or administrative border. But broadly speaking, the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine had more proportionally speaking population that was ethnic Russian and or Russian speaking, and the center and the west was more Ukrainian and Ukrainian speaking. And that translated, when we think about politics, into preferences that reflected themselves in the elections. And Ukraine, unlike Russia, had competitive elections and presidents regularly lost power, whereby kind of more pro-Russian and more pro-Western leaders alternated in power. So essentially, the political process was that president would come to power with support either disproportionately from the center and the west of the country, or from the south and the east, would invariably disappoint voters for failing to improve the economy, fight corruption, all of that, and then would be replaced by somebody from the opposition representing the other part, right? So sort of this kind of pro-Russian, pro-Western alternating political power. And that would have stayed, and that didn't go anywhere. And I would argue that even after 2014, which was a pivotal moment in Ukraine in many ways, when pro-Russian President Yanukovych was driven out by the Euromaidan protests, electoral geography didn't change, the people didn't go. Euromaidan had regionally skewed bases of support. And it is more likely than not that had Putin not done anything in 2014, in other words, had he not annexed Crimea, had he not started insurgency in Donbass, it is very likely that pro-Russian parties would have continued to receive substantial support during the election times. It's also quite possible that whichever president would have come elected in 2019 would have been much more pro-Russian. And basically, Ukraine would have continued on this sort of path between East and West. Again, to add further, not only there was no appetite in NATO to admit Ukraine, I think we need the consensus there. Clearly, there wasn't a consensus, France and Germany in particular, and of course, authoritarian Hungary were not going to approve Ukraine's NATO membership, and Ukrainian public didn't want it either. The support for NATO before 2014 never exceeded 20-25% at most in any poll. Right. So this is sort of the reality. And again, this is, I think it's like it's a tragic paradox, but it is really a paradox that Putin has made Ukraine so much more pro-Western and anti-Russian than any Ukrainian nation builder ever did, than any nationalist ever did, than any sort of mystical Nazis or, propaganda or whatever it is that he's talking about. But basically what happened, so after 2014, we begin to see very substantial changes in both public opinion and elite preferences. So once Ukraine was under attack, right, the territory was annexed, this war had started, we begin to see change in the public opinion in the regions of the country that were historically much more pro-Russian. Before the invasion, just a few weeks before, a group of colleagues of mine that based out in the UK, they ran this project called Mobilize, when they do massive surveys, and they've been doing them regularly for many years in Ukraine. They found for the first time that in southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, support for NATO actually exceeded opposition at first time ever, right? And that was direct consequence of Putin's actions. And add to it that once these territories were annexed after 2014, and the people in Crimea and in eastern Donbass, who have been historically the most kind of pro-Russian electorate in Ukraine, they stopped participating in the Ukrainian elections, right? So we have the more or less about 12% of the electorate that was cut out from the voter rolls, which again made it mathematically much more difficult, hypothetically even, for any kind of pro-Russian force to win in Ukraine. So we have sort of this, interesting phenomena that on the one hand, Ukraine definitely has become much more oriented towards Europe and more sort of this on defense. Right, but it's also a direct consequence of Putin's actions and not some mystical, nationalism or, Nazism or whatever, whatever Putin claims. So if we now, bring it to the current situation, we actually continue to see this process of nation building continuing to this day. We now have Putin's army bombing East Ukrainian cities where people speak Russian, where people still had, up until the war, certainly more friendly attitudes towards Russia than people in the West. And we see people rising up there, cursing the occupiers. So again, we see this massive kind of, consolidation of Ukrainian national identity. That in that sense, of course, it's tragic what's happening, but it's also kind of, not unique that we see many countries where the process of nation building historically oftentimes had these periods of intense conflict that are like pivotal, right? And this is when we see acceleration of these processes. I would further add, you are, many of you may be taking courses on nationalism, a few students in the audience, that this whole premise, this discussion, like, is Ukraine, is there something to Putin's argument, like, isn't there Kiev and Rus, like, doesn't it give some credence, that Ukrainians are not really, Ukrainians or what have you? I think engaging with the specifics of his arguments make no sense whatsoever. That's because his whole premise that there are somehow natural and somehow artificial nations is just wrong. Scholars of nationalism have long rejected this conception, which he advocates, which we call in academia primordial view, essentially that there are nations that formed in the midst of history, in the many centuries or thousands of years ago, and somehow these national communities sort of continue through history as these primordial entities, more or less unchanged, kind of organic. This is how he sees it. Instead, scholarship and nationalism have long rejected this view, and historians have rejected this view. This is not how it works. If you sort of imagine this whole idea that people belong to a nation, that the poorest person in a particular nation and the king are equal as members of the nation, these are fundamentally new ideas. They're relatively recent in history. People didn't even think about themselves as belonging to these imagined communities, right, up until relatively modern period when we see the rise of the nationalist movements in Europe, economic development, people moving out of the villages. So instead of what's constructivist, this is sort of alternative perspective, and that's why I think Putin should be, if you do want to debate him, I would debate him on a theoretical level and not on some sort of factual details about what happened in whatever year, 1,000 years ago. Every nation is constructed. So in some sense, Ukraine is an artificial nation, but so is Russian nation, so is French nation, so is Polish nation, because the process of nation building, when people come to realize and think of themselves as this imagined community, that people you never saw in your life, who don't live in your village, who are different from you, who you may never meet, like who are from different socioeconomic class, right, who are different political class, that you and them belong to this imagined community of a nation, it is a very new idea. Right, and in Ukraine, this process has been very complicated, as Professor Kovalchuk was saying. In some ways it was delayed, in part because also this process never had support of a centralized state, because Ukraine didn't have, a history of stable statehood. But Ukrainian nation, like now, people, as long as people believe themselves to belong to Ukrainian nation, that nation exists, and that's something that Putin just can't wrap his mind around, and he's trying to dispute this. And in a way, I think that would be his undoing. So that's, I think, again, we sort of come to the current crisis when Putin invaded, and I'll also reference a little bit the speech that Professor Kovalchuk already talked about. I think it's pretty clear, given his narrative, that he expected that Ukrainians would welcome Russians as liberators, because if your whole belief is that ultimately, Ukrainians are really Russians, and they are oppressed by this small group of quote unquote Nazis, right? So, and all you need to do is to, take out these Nazis, and then, the rest of Ukrainians would live happily ever after with, under Russian rule. Like that's proved out to be completely false. And of course, all of us who study Ukraine, like, we would know, that it would be false. But he clearly, then I think the way his military operation faltered, right, the way that the Ukrainian army is beating them, that they can't imagine, the way you've probably seen the footage from Ukraine, regular people unarmed coming and blocking Russian tanks in Russian-speaking cities, right? And then Putin is bombing these like Russian-speaking, cities in the east of the country where, supposedly the brotherly people live. So it's completely, mind-boggling, of course, right? But also I think goes to show his deep misunderstanding. Unfortunately, I think at this point, Russia has become a personalistic dictatorship. I mean, if anybody doubted that before, I think we had all sorts of theories, is Russia a competitive authoritarian regime? Is it like managed democracy, right? Like who has what sort of influences, right? Like what are the groups of influence? I think now it's pretty clear that decisions there are basically made essentially by one man. I would say sort of going forward, I don't want to take too much time, but let me just say a couple of things, what I think we should be looking for. First of all, I don't think there is any kind of off-ramp. These diplomatic negotiations, of course, should continue because, if nothing else, at least to let civilians, some safe corridors, humanitarian aid. I think these are all, goals, even if nothing else. But as far as sort of these expectations that somehow Putin could see the light of day and could somehow get, satisfied, like if sanctions, I mean, I saw some commentary yesterday, or like, I just honestly quite in disbelief that like, maybe if we promise to ease the sanctions, he will withdraw the troops. Like, no, like he made it very clear. He wants to annihilate Ukraine as a sovereign entity, as an independent country. And we should also be very clear-eyed that this denazification that he talks about, it is not just rhetoric. I mean, he considers anybody who does not view Soviet history in particular and sort of this Ukrainian-Russian relations the way he does as a Nazi. So when we're talking about denazification, we are not just talking about Putin going after quote unquote real Nazis like, you know, the Azov battalion or like the French far-right groups we have in Ukraine. It does not include just the Ukrainian government, of course, with the fantastically Nazi Jewish president and primarily Russian-speaking cabinet. It literally involves civil society activists. It would involve historians. It would involve scholars, see people who work on the Stalin's crimes, right? People who work on the Second World War, anti-corruption activists, all of these people are Nazis. So if Putin does take control of the country, and the only way he could do it would be to completely sort of turn all of Ukraine into essentially Aleppo or Grozny and have massive presence of Russian troops, because there won't be any other way to control the country of 44 million people and the size of France. We could literally see concentration camps. We could see wide-scale repression. So I think that's what's at stake here. So I think when there are discussions about sort of what is to be done, sending more weapons or sending aircrafts or not sending aircrafts, closing the sky, there is of course concerns in the West. I can understand that the no-fly zone would involve conflict with Russia, which might provoke Putin to use nuclear weapons. First of all, I think that's a legitimate concern, but we also don't know under what conditions Putin would use nuclear weapons. I think he had, we can say that he lost touch with reality. He lives in his own world. He believes Russia is threatened. The argument that now they're peddling in Russia, and actually, unfortunately, people believe it. If you watch some interviews with the Russian public that were on the internet, people do believe it, that actually Russia is not attacking Ukraine, but it is protecting itself. That this war is not a war of aggression, but it's a defensive war, because otherwise Russia will get attacked, right? So kind of keeping this in mind. But I think certainly supporting the Ukrainian military, providing it with aircrafts, I think would be absolutely should be on the table. If any of you feel that, I urge you to write to your representatives and encourage them to do this, because the only way this would end would be either that Russia is defeated, and that could only happen if Ukrainian army remains functional and battle capable, and continue to drain Putin's resources, right? We will see now that the more time goes by, sort of the time is on Ukrainian side, if they can hold on, because I'm sure we will see processes within Russia. I don't have time to go into it now, but I'll just want to put it on the table maybe for further discussion, that the kinds of sanctions that were slapped on Russian society, on Russian elites, I think they would have some consequence. We don't know exactly today what consequence those would be, but I don't think things in Russia will continue the same way they did before. So in other words, for Putin to run some sort of increasingly repressive North Korean style regime, which seems where he's headed. I haven't seen the news today, but there were discussions they might introduce martial law. I think the parliament is meeting. There is already, greater repression. All remaining independent media has been banned. So we will see, things happening in Russia that we may not even predict, right? I'm not going to go into predictions, but I think sort of, basically putting the kind of cost on Putin, and hopefully that would lead to his removal one way or the other. Right, and for that, I think Ukrainian army needs to be able to hold on and receive all and any assistance from the rest of the world that it can. Because if it can't, and I'll add with this is not particularly optimistic scenario, but if Putin were to win, I mean, just think what it would mean, right? Like some might say, well, it's local conflict in Ukraine, like it doesn't matter for us. It's a country of 44 million people, right? Like if they are going to level these cities with millions of people in them, if they're going to kill untold, probably hundreds of thousands of people, right? We're going to have refugee flights in the tens of millions. That's not a fantasy. Like that's what sort of Putin's victory will look like, right? In the heart of Europe. So that is something, right? That is not, just sort of back to things as normal, just no Ukraine there anymore. I mean, these are the things that have consequences, right? Imagine that, right? For Europe, practical consequences, kind of moral consequences for the world. So really, I think the only two possibilities here is either Putin's defeat or Putin's victory. I don't see any sort of diplomatic, solution that Putin somehow will be reasoned with, and some sanctions will be traded for troops withdrawal or anything like that. He's out there to destroy Ukraine. So I think we should all be very clear about that. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of issues to discuss. We have a few questions in the Q&A. And before we turn to those, there was one area of common ground that both of you addressed, and that concerns this interest, this intensity in the southeastern region of Ukraine. And I was going to ask first Natalia and then Oksana to respond to this question. seeing that there is intense battle, that we know that Kherson has been occupied, that there's interest in Odessa. And I think, Natalia, in your portion of the presentation, you mentioned Novorossiya. When we think about nation building, and this builds upon Oksana's remark about that all nations are constructed. Is essentially Putin looking at an expansion of Russia in this area, or is this in a certain sense an attempt to build a new nation in the image of Russia through force and through violence? So why don't we start with that question, and then I'll turn to the other questions. First, Natalia, and then Oksana.
I think that Putin's vision is rather archaic. Pointing out to what Professor Shebel was saying about primordialist versus constructivist approach, he definitely considered Russian nation as an eternal entity, which was there always, which included the lands of Great Russia and so-called White Russia and Little Russia, which were local version of the Great Russian nationality. He doesn't cope with the reality. He didn't accept the fact that within the last 30 years, Ukrainian political nation have been formed, which consists of people of different ethnic backgrounds and different religious affiliations. And he also, as I mentioned, he lives in a fantasy world. And in this way, and also he's been informed by his agent in Ukraine, and as such, we mean Medvedchuk in the first place, who were constantly telling him that he is expected to take over Ukraine, that he would be welcomed here, and especially in the southeastern region. I think it was another big shock for Putin to see that no one is actually meeting him with flowers in Kherson or Kharkiv or Odessa. He cannot comprehend the new Ukrainian reality. He doesn't really know it. Because, well, the questions which are now listed here, if Putin believes that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, how can he be killing them and destroying the land? I'm afraid I cannot be too diplomatic or even academic here. I think that he behaves like a psychopath, as an abusive husband who just is not ready, who would rather kill his wife than let her go. We cannot rationally analyze his actions because they are deeply psychotic.
Thank you, Natalia. Oksana, I would invite you to comment on the same topic of nation building, of Putin's response, and especially on this concentration on southeastern region of Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I think as far as his plans, I mean, I totally agree with what Dr. Kovalchuk is saying. I think he lives in his own world, right? I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think this whole argument sort of what counts as rationality, right? Like in his view, maybe it's like rational, right? Like if you really believe that Ukrainians and Russians are one nation, right, then you're gonna like try to unify them or whatever. Now, the fact that Ukrainian nation rejects that, right, and he keeps pushing, right, I mean, I think that's where we get into sort of this disconnect from reality. And yes, I think the analogy with abusive husband is very apt. as far as sort of him wanting to create a new nation, I don't think so, because I mean, the nation, as far as he sees it, is already there, just waiting to be liberated. I think political arrangement, he's probably open for, I mean, if he did get his way and got control over Ukraine, I mean, it was actually, I don't know if your audience might not know, accidentally victory plans were leaked in the Russian media, because they plan to take Kyiv in 2 days. So one of these Russian government websites, I forgot which one, published an article that has since been taken down, but there is a web archive version of it. It's sort of like the new world, right? Like what happens. And it's really chilling, because first of all, it talks about the solution to quote unquote the Ukrainian question, right? So Putin solved the quote unquote the Ukrainian question, right? We all, can hear the parallels with solving certain question, right? And then, as far as political arrangements, they say, well, it could be like some sort of, Russia-led Eurasian Union, it could be like customs union, right? So I think, if they did control the country and had some sort of puppet government stably there, which I don't think they will, because as I said, I think it would involve sustained and massive occupation for which they don't have the forces. Then, I don't think they would technically recreate the Soviet Union and call it the Soviet Union, right? Like it could be some sort of other, quasi statelet formation, may still keep its, token sovereignty, or at least be called, something other than Russia. So I think that is open question. Like you say, he did win, like what kind of construct politically it would be. But I think, as far as creating a new nation, I don't think that's the plan. I think the plan is to sort of restore the nation to its quote unquote rightful borders and rightful place.
Thank you very much. We have a kind of a cluster of questions concerning information and the perspectives that citizens of the various countries have. So for example, one of our attendees is asking concerning the worldview itself, this view of the political situation, this view of history, is this specific just to Putin? Do Russian institutions internalize this view? The ordinary Russian citizens, do they have access to alternative information? So I ask both of you to address this issue as well, in terms of when we look at Putin and how do we compare Putin to the rest of Russia? And then the follow-up question for that would be, what can we as academics and academic institutions do to clarify this information, both for our students and also for the general public? So this time, why don't we start with Oksana and then turn to Natalia?
Yeah, as far as views within Russia, I mean, this kind of narrative that Ukrainians and Russians are really one people ultimately, or, Ukrainians are like younger brothers and so forth. I mean, that's pretty widespread. I mean, that's, I think there are some, if you look at the polls, I think there are a little bit like generational difference, say like younger people maybe are less care about it, right? But that's certainly not unique to Putin, right? Now, but from that, I mean, that's a big jump to say that, and I have seen these arguments, I don't agree with them, but like even if Putin is replaced somehow, like whoever comes, another hardliner comes to power, they would do the same thing. I don't think so, because what Putin is now doing is really really out there, right? It's one thing to say that, Ukraine, is really not like a real quote unquote nation, right? It's one thing to say like, okay, we don't want, Ukraine to be in NATO or something along those lines. It's quite different to begin bombing these Ukrainian cities. So I think a change in leadership in Russia would have big consequences, and I think has a very good chance to end this war, right? Even though, it doesn't have to be, I think it would be naive to expect that some sort of liberal Democrat would take over, because again, all the liberal opposition in Russia has been long, eliminated. Navalny is in jail. It's not even clear if he would win free election, and that sort of goes to availability of information to the Russian public. As we all know, right, the media is very tightly controlled. So if you are your average person, especially in the provinces, who goes to work, who comes home, turns on TV to watch, after dinner, like you are getting very, very, managed message, let's put it this way. And that this message is out, like the one that Putin sends. And that's when we see, in these interviews with the Russians who honestly believe that there is, they're liberating Ukrainians from some genocide or, all that nonsense, or that, NATO is about to attack. So, now, is the alternative source of information? Yes, I mean, there is still some internet. They repeatedly keep, now I think more and more would be tightening. Also, the information is filtering from the battlefield, right? Like if people have their relatives getting killed there, right? Like that's, I mean, I'm not super optimistic that it would lead to some sea change in public opinion. So my short answer to this question would be that yes, like the majority of the Russian public, broadly speaking, shares this Putin's worldview. But that doesn't mean, you know, that there is support for this completely crazy, you know, military adventure. Right. And also, I think, you know, as in any country, I think public opinion is something that can change, although this change is not necessarily instant. Right. So again, as I'm saying, I think with the sanctions, with the economic consequence, right, with more knowledge about the losses, Russian losses on the battlefield, right, we may see, you know, processes in the Russian society that haven't been there yet. Right. But I think that's a little bit too early to speculate what those might be and how fast they might unfold.
Thank you. Natalia, would you like to comment as well?
Yes, I think what we see now is also very much revanchist sentiment shared with elites and many citizens of Russia. The disintegration of the Soviet Union and the crisis which followed was very painful. And both in terms of hardships of everyday life and on the level of self-assessments of representation as formerly a great nation, one of the big powers. So Putin is appealing to many as someone who promised to bring this feeling of belonging to a great nation, to a great power back. So they want this feeling of playing a significant part, having an influence on the history, on contemporary history of the world. The 90s were the time when democratic changes were happening in Russia. And then when Putin came to power, and especially when his second round of presidencies started, this official discourse has changed dramatically. It became archaic. It appealed more and more to imperial nationalistic discourse of official pan-Slavism of the late Russian Empire. And as such, it doesn't limit itself to the territory of the former Russian Empire. It also claims the responsibility of Russia for the whole Slavic world, for the Balkans, for the Central Europe. These ideas were quite popular both in political and academic circles. They were also became especially prominent after 2013, after the annexation of Crimea, where there was a chain of conferences discussing pan-Slavic figures like Danilevsky, for example, and his Russia and Europe book, claiming that Russia and Europe are in eternal conflict with each other, and that Russia has to destroy Europe, or otherwise Europe will destroy Russia. And also it carries all these ideas of Russian spiritual superiority, of a special role in the world. You probably noticed that this official discourse, contemporary official discourse, describes everything which happens in Europe as corrupted, as materialistic, while Russia is high above. It's spiritual nation which doesn't care about mundane things. And yes, these ideas are popular. You could see, I could see it in a close circle of my Russian counterpart and colleagues, or rather, I would rather say former colleagues, because most of them said nothing at all within the last week, even though they visited Ukraine many times. They ate, drank, admired our nature and our architecture. They had numerous scholarly discussions with us. Now they do not even protest. They don't even privately express any kind of sorrow or sympathy. So I think that this problem is wider than Putin. I think this revanchist sentiment, imperialist sentiment, is very much widespread.
Thank you very much. I want to, there were a couple of questions that emerged about the role of religion, and in particular about the Orthodox churches. So Natalia, you just mentioned a sort of like a messianic exceptionalism, spiritual authority, and we know historically that after the fall of Constantinople, that there were certain references to Russia as the Third Rome in the 16th century. And even during the Soviet period, a sort of attempt on the part of the Moscow Patriarchate or the Russian Orthodox Church to assert itself as the leading authority. And I'm very curious to hear both of your thoughts on the religious situation on the ground, both in Ukraine and also in Russia. Because on the one hand, we know that the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, has either been silent or has at least seemingly upheld the ideological line, whereas in Ukraine, the responses seem to be both diverse and even antagonistic toward Russia, even within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate. So one of the questions, I guess, is what role, if any, can religious leaders play in peacemaking, in intervention, and what role do they play in perhaps some kind of de-escalation? So for example, there are a number of people who are pleading with Patriarch Kirill to do something to intervene. So why don't we start, Natalia, with you, and then turn to Oksana.
Okay, so honestly, I don't think that it makes much sense to appeal to Patriarch Kirill, because he is not silent. In fact, he supported Putin's move into Ukraine. I think that there are some dissidents within the Moscow Patriarchy who wouldn't support that, and I also read about them protesting. So it could lead to some kind of internal conflict within the Orthodox Church. As I'm not an expert of this matter, honestly, so I would rather stop here. But I think that the role of religious leaders is enormous. I think that both Catholic Church and Orthodox Church of Ukraine doing whatever they can, both on the ground, like protecting people, offering shelters, supporting humanitarian mission, but also diplomatically, trying to negotiate humanitarian corridors and so on. I think that praying for peace is always important. But it's also important to bear in mind that politically, Russian Orthodox Church, how to put it, did not limit herself to exclusively spiritual life of its subjects. It also played a political role and providing ideological background for aggressive policies by the Russian Empire or modern Russian Federation. That's why we have to be aware of that.
Thank you. Oksana, would you like to comment on the role
yes,
of
let me
churches?
just very briefly, I'm also not an expert in ecclesiastical things, but I have studied kind of political angle of the Orthodox Church politics in Ukraine. So first of all, I would agree with Natalia. I think the Russian Patriarch, I mean, I would be blunt here. I think he will, have to wash off the shame of his support for this slaughter. I mean, that's essentially what he did. He basically, endorsed, this whole symphony between the Russian Church and state and the Patriarch embracing this, reunited Russian people. And yeah, so I think that's basically, I have no hope that the patriarch, you know, in Moscow would somehow, you know, do anything to end that. What we do see in Ukraine, and this is actually very interesting, and the better circumstances, I would be studying it in great detail. We actually see now a break, or at least the beginning of a break, between the Moscow Church, right, the Russian Orthodox Church and its leadership in Moscow, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy, which is, you know, under the umbrella, or like under the, I don't know how, whatever is the politically correct way to describe them, of the control of the Russian church in Ukraine, right? As you all know, there are two Orthodox churches there now, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which has the Thomas from the Patriarch in Constantinople that the Moscow Church considers schismatic, right? And then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy that, you know, in Ukraine has been doing very delicate balancing act, you know, that they try to say that they're independent from Moscow, you know, more sort of, you know, many, especially in the kind of center-right political spectrum in Ukraine, don't believe this. But what we actually see there now, that we see a protest brewing from within this church, from the Moscow Patriarchy Church in Kiev, right? We already had some bishops. I can't remember, maybe Dr. Denisenko remembers, I think now about 15 bishops that spoke out and said that they're not going to pomionati, like what is the English term, like when you recall or like name Patriarch Kirill in the service, like I'm lost for words. They're like pomionati.
Liturgical commemoration.
Liturgical commemoration. Thank you. Right. So they already said they're not going to do that. Right. That's a big, you know, big break. It's some organization called the Union of Orthodox Journalists, the SPJ, which has been the most, like one of the most pro-Russian groups in sort of the church kind of you know, in the really groups within the Russian Orthodox Church, has spoken out against the war. I think there is now pressure on the Metropolitan Onufry to kind of more decisively potentially break, you know, with, or you know, at least come out sort of stronger. They already said they don't support the war, and they support the army and all of this. So I think, you know, it's maybe too early to say now, and that's certainly not kind of the first order of things, but I wouldn't be surprised when, after all is said and done, if we see, you know, major realignment within the religious Orthodox politics in Ukraine, and actually the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy finally breaking with Moscow, you know, with the Russian Orthodox Church potentially uniting. I mean, it's, again, as I said, I think it's a little bit too early to say, but I wouldn't exclude that possibility that we actually would see finally Orthodox unity in Ukraine as a result of this conflict. And that would be yet another irony, right? Like, as I was saying, you know, what Putin was doing has been bringing Ukrainians closer and closer together and further from Russia. And if it ends up, you know, the unification of these Orthodox churches, I mean, that would really be something. And again, it would be, you know, due to Putin. So the irony of it really, you know, shouldn't be lost on us all.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, this is something that is a process in evolution. It's gradually developing on the ground. I've been monitoring the social media sharing of information, and I have noticed that a number of bishops at the grassroots level are calling for the convocation of a council of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow to immediately consider either on their own taking or claiming autocephaly or independence, or petitioning Patriarch Kirill to grant it. So this is certainly an issue that is needs to be monitored moving forward, and it's a very important one. We had a number of questions concerning the threat beyond Central and Eastern Europe. Questions about global security, concerns about nuclear war. And I want to kind of fold this larger question on the security threat to the rest of the world into the whole role of NATO and the United States. What I have in mind here is we have heard in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, all of the grievances that Putin had about NATO. And for some reason, I can't get out of my own head that famous picture at Yalta of the so-called victors all sitting together, where you have President Roosevelt and you have Stalin in the same picture. To what degree have the Westerners, NATO and the United States, perhaps not considered Russia's role in contributing to the maintaining of the world or the international order, especially considering Russia's veneration for the Great Patriotic War and the defeat of the Nazis. Is this something to be considered in terms of continued diplomatic relations, even if there is not going to be an off-ramp for Putin? Oksana, why don't we start with you, and then we can ask Natalia to chime in as well.
I'm saying I spaced out there for a second. The question is kind of implications for outside Ukraine, or like, because I missed the tail end of your question.
Well, yeah, it's really two questions. First is, have the United States and NATO really taken the Russian position, really respected the Russian position, considering Russia's role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II? Are we taking them seriously enough? And in that same vein, what kind of a threat is posed to the rest of the world? Because I think that there's a certain sense that, well, this is a problem that's far away, right? In terms of global security, how careful should NATO and the United States be in their continued dealings, both with Ukraine and with Russia?
Yeah, well, let me maybe start with the end of this question, right? Like, is this really just about Ukraine? You know, could it spread in some way? I mean, I think there are several ways. I mean, first of all, I think it is definitely about more than just Ukraine, and I think there are different ways to think about it. Like, one is sort of simply kind of humanitarian aspect, if you want to think about it, human aspect, right? Because we're having a country, it's not some small country that's been invaded, right? It's a country of 44 million. Like just the sheer consequence, right, of the refugee flows from this country, right, of this destruction, right, of the death, like loss of life, right? Like, to say that this somehow can be contained and doesn't affect anybody other than Ukrainians, I think is clearly, you know, just not right. Now, additionally, I mean, if you think about sort of the world order, if you want to think about it this way, we have here a case of naked aggression of one country against the other, right? Destruction of civilian life, destruction of the very principle of international law, right? Destruction of, you know, democracy, if you want to think about it this way. So all of these sort of values, right, that the world, civilized world, supposedly holds after the Second World War, right, after Helsinki, like sovereignty, all of this is being challenged, and not in some sort of backroom dealing, but basically by naked aggression, right? So if, say, you know, Putin is not stopped, he only gets emboldened. I mean, this is the pattern that we've seen, right? Like, he went in on Georgia, he went, you know, in Crimea, he kind of gets a slap on the wrist, more or less, right? We now have this greater, the greater adventure. So I think Putin will continue to pose a threat to NATO. He would be emboldened, right? I mean, they would laugh at sort of like, you know, NATO and the West sort of, you know, threatened us, and they, and look, we showed them, right? We showed them, we can show them again. So I think this is definitely, and if we add to it, again, the country with nuclear weapons, and as I said, I think the rationality, and Professor Kovalchuk was saying, I think the rationality of Putin is now anyone's bet. We don't know under what sorts of circumstances he may use tactical nuclear weapons, right? Some sort of, you know, escalation, right? Some sort of subversion. I mean, they're talking about, you know, I think the Baltic states definitely would be endangered, right? I think they feel that. I mean, it's basically, so, I mean, what I'm trying to say, that both kind of as a moral and practical and kind of immediate impact type thing, and as this sort of more broader issue of principles, like how the world is organized, right? Like, we are in a completely new world now. So I think it does have, you know, big consequences. And the first question, Nicholas, again, was?
The first part of the question was, is there any possibility that the NATO has not
really taken
heard
Russian interests? Right.
Yes.
Yes, we of course had this, you know, this is the narrative coming from Russia, right? That they have been somehow humiliated, that, you know, the West hasn't taken the interest seriously and so forth, right? I mean, this is an argument you can't win, right? Like, you can point to facts. I mean, how is Russia exactly humiliated, right? They had a seat at this major country. It has a seat on the UN Security Council, right? It has been, you know, like, they had a seat on the G8, right? It had, you know, various economic mess that existed in Russia. It wasn't really the West doing. I mean, we can debate to what extent, you know, reform advice that was given to reforms, what Yeltsin did, like, was or was not, you know, correct. But to say that somehow, like, Russia was ignored, I think that's just like, I mean, they think that, right? But I don't think that's the same to say that this was actually what's happening. More importantly, right, it's now in a situation, and I think that has been brewing for some time, that they are not considering security. I mean, we can say Russia has legitimate maybe interests in not having certain weapons, you know, near its border. Okay, fair enough. right? But they're not willing to engage about these specific security concerns. I think when this whole crisis started, right, when Putin made this maximalist demands, US, I think, offered, from what I remember reading in the, the responses that were public, to discuss all of these specific military things, right? Like, let's talk about, where you're going to do the exercises or not do, right? Like, let's talk about which weapons will be placed there. Like, that's not what they wanted, right? So they basically created this narrative that we are a besieged fortress and you're out to get us. If you read the speech that he gave, the pre-invasion speech, this completely unhinged, long rambling speech, I mean, he's saying things there that are just mind-boggling. Things such as, like, US is fully controlling Ukraine down to the last platoon, down to the last municipality, right? And it's all aimed at Russia, right? The advisors that came to Ukraine, let's say, to work on the anti-corruption reforms, it is all aimed at Russia. So I think you can't really reason, right? Like, when you're trying to say, okay, if you feel insecure, let's talk about what is it that you feel insecure about, right? Like, is this like certain type of missile? Like, they don't want to engage like this, right? Anything, like, it's like the West is existential threat. Putin said it has always been about basically taking Russia out. This is very kind of Cold War KGB mentality. So I don't even know how do you engage with this. I think the constructive engagement would be to kind of break the sense of insecurity into concrete pieces and say, like, okay, like, let's talk about how we can agree on, as I said, certain aspects of the military potential that pose potential threat. That's not, he's not willing to engage in this, right? And again, with Ukraine and NATO, first of all, as I was saying, the chance of Ukraine getting into NATO was zero. I can't imagine Putin or his advisors wouldn't see this. I mean, how possibly would Ukraine get into NATO? It needs a consensus in NATO. There was never such consensus, right? Like, the population, as I said, until very recently was against it, right? Like, there was just no way. Right, but yet he says that NATO is going to fight with Ukrainians to retake Crimea. Like, what, So I, unfortunately, I mean, it's sort of like it's talking past each other, because you can bring in all this evidence that people did to show how actually, the West is not threatening NATO, right? It's not ignoring Russia, but that's not what he believes, and it seems like it's impossible to engage, on kind of in a way that you get past each other with these narratives.
Natalia, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think that the Second World War and the myth of Russian special role in defeating Nazi Germany was very important in the last couple of decades. I think it's a cornerstone of the myth of Russian greatness, because first, as I mentioned in my presentation before, the Soviet Union is presented in this narrative as a ethnically Russian state. Ergo, Russians are the nation who defeated Nazi Germany, and also it's the nation who suffered the most. If you look at the map of the Second World War, you would see that only a portion of Russian Federation was occupied, while, for example, Ukraine and Belarus were occupied in total. Ukraine was the site of some of the most horrific crimes of the Nazi occupiers, including Babi Yar, the largest number of people, of Jews, killed in Europe. Elsewhere, it's 30,000 in 2 days. And speaking of which, recently, Russian army, who is currently denazifying Ukraine, bombed Babi Yar, which adds another crazy dimension to this whole narrative discourse of liberation. But I think that Russian Federation played this card, posing itself as the sole victor, as the most important force in anti-Nazi coalition. They played this card to the max, especially in their relations with Germany, because that's one of the reasons, besides their business interests, but any opposition to Russian politics would be interpreted as following Nazi steps, opposing anti-Nazi force, and so on and so forth. However crazy and lunatic such ideas sound. Now, what about today's situation and security situation in Europe and the world? Even if I didn't live in Ukraine now, I would be concerned that it seems to be that there is no one there to deal with an international bully. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is a war crime. It's international terrorism. I think we all, as citizens of the world, need to find out the way to deal with such behavior. It's not a local Ukrainian problem, not at all. And not only because of all the possible outcomes like refugees, economic crisis, and so on. It's really a security threat. No one knows where Putin would stop. And I think it's in the best interest of the world, of the free world, to stop him as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. We're running short on time. We have about 5 minutes left. So I just want to ask a very quick question for both of our panelists. It's one that has come up a couple of times in the Q&A. My colleague here at Valparaiso University, Professor Bagel Johnson, asks about, is there a way for Putin to save face in this situation, to declare victory while withdrawing troops and going home? And this is something that those of us who are glued to the news are constantly hearing about an off-ramp. I thought I heard skepticism throughout this presentation. Is there a way for this to not end in some kind of bloodshed catastrophe? Can you imagine any way where he could say, okay, this is enough, go home? Or are we looking at really truly a new normal on the lives and the bloodshed of the bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder calls it, of Ukraine? So for the last comment before I wrap it up, first Natalia and then Oksana.
It's really hard to predict. I and probably many of my colleagues had an illusion that the recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics was the move which would allow Putin to claim that he actually achieved his victory, his aim in Ukraine. But as we could see, he didn't stop there. Also knowing the way he thinks about the world around him, and knowing him as a psychotic type of person, I'm not optimistic about that. I don't know. I think he needs to be defeated, but I'm not an expert in military history or strategy.
Oksana, would you like to share your final reflection with us?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I was trying to say this in my comments. I mean, I just don't see him, given the maximalist aims that he said, right? Given that he wants denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, to even hope that he somehow now can just say, well, okay, like, I don't know, they taken Kherson. Like, what is he going to say? Like, okay, we taken Kherson, we are now going to pack up and go home. Like, as Natalia was saying, I think when they recognized this LNR and DNR republics, I think many people, myself included, thought like, okay, like that's going to be the new situation, right? Like it was essentially reflected facts on the ground, right? He could have continued to squeeze Ukraine every other way, like they had naval blockade, cyber war, like, and kind of we thought like that's going to be the new normal, right? Like, but he clearly escalated now to the point and set the goals. So I think that's it. That's what I'm saying. I think like Ukraine should be helped to fight this. I mean, they're fighting tooth and nail. The army has proved itself to be quite much more capable than anybody expected. I saw a parallel with Berlin in 1953 question in the comment. I think one difference here now is that, and that also actually goes for support for Ukrainian insurgency after the Second World War. As we know, in Western Ukraine, there was, the nationalists were fighting the Soviet Union well into the 50s. But then, there was no regular army, there was no regular state, right? There was no Western support. The borders like around Ukraine, where at that time, Poland was already in the communist bloc. And even under those circumstances, those people in the woods, right, like held for like 10 years. I mean, it's terrible to think this, but I really think Putin, I agree with Natalia, I think he needs to be defeated. I don't see any other way. I mean, if, and I think it can come from different directions. I think Ukraine continuing to be able to hold it on the battlefield is hugely important. Kiev not falling is hugely important. But I think also the sanctions, that are being put on Russia, as I was saying, like we didn't have time to talk about it, and it might be too early, but I think we will see domestic developments in Russia we haven't seen in a long time. It's hard to predict what those are, but I mean, there will be change there too. I don't think like he can sort of continue this stability. I mean, it's irony, right? Again, he praised himself as somebody who brought stability relative to instability of the 1990s. And now, like, in one weekend, he threw stability out of the window for the Russians as well. So I think that would have consequences as well.
It's very difficult for all of us in the age of digital media watching these events unfold in real time and seeing catastrophic events play out right in front of us to be able to accept that this may have to unfold over a period of time. But that is indeed what history teaches us, that sometimes it takes time for things to get to a point where the end can actually come. And the end of our time is now arriving. So please join me in thanking Dr. Oksana Shevel of Tufts University and Dr. Natalia Kovalchuk of the Ukrainian Catholic University for joining us today and for informing us and sharing their expertise with us. A number of you asked about humanitarian aid. I put a link in the chat to one source that will lead you to a number of NGOs and organizations that are delivering humanitarian aid for Ukrainian refugees.
Could I put another link? I have another link.
Yes, please do. Please go ahead and add the link.
Can I do it to host and panelists, everyone, right? Okay, so.
And while Oksana adds her link. Yep.
And there is also a document that people put together, like a master Google Doc that I think gets periodically, regularly updated, that has also all various ways to donate to Ukraine. Let me share that link too.
Thank you very much. And while you do that, Oksana, wonderful, that's excellent. I will just add that this session was recorded. So one of the primary ways, in addition to humanitarian aid, that we can do good and contribute to de-escalation is to inform other people about what is actually happening on the ground. Warfare is not only on the physical battlefield anymore, it is also waged in the classroom and in the public sphere. And here at Valparaiso University, an important part of our mission is pursuit of the truth, no matter where it leads us. So on that note, we send our prayers to your loved ones, to all of those who are in Ukraine for their safety, for the preservation of their lives. And we pray for a very quick end to this war. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Be safe, and God willing, we can come together to talk about something more pleasant in the future.
In the better times, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
for coming.
Have a good day.
Thank you.